Hi, my name is Chris Dobler. I'm from the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk at the University of Texas at Austin. And my presentation is called Exploring Direct Observation Data within an IES-funded efficacy trial. So on today's agenda, I'll spend the next 15-20 minutes talking about case for the research, discuss some of the active ingredients of interventions within our program of research, then give a brief overview of the Roots efficacy project, as well as our observation system. I'll also talk about some of the different findings from our observation work, then follow up with a brief discussion of those findings. So a quick acknowledgement to our funding agency, IES, as well as the different research partners, Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon, as well as the Meadows Center at UT Austin. Also, there are a host of folks behind the scenes, as well at the forefront of this research. Primarily, this research is led by Dr. Ben Clark, University of Oregon. So over the last 15 to 20 years, the field of education science has come leaps and bounds in terms of just really advancing the different knowledge bases. And this is primarily attributed to the funding that's been invested through IES, primarily focusing in on funding randomized control trials and looking at answering questions about what works and in some cases what does not work. And while that information is critical for building the knowledge base around educational interventions, alone it's insufficient to really discern what works for whom and under what conditions. And we would argue to really understand those treatment effects, it really requires unpacking the black box and looking at the active ingredients of different interventions. And so by active ingredients, just operationally define them as these theoretically specified mechanisms, mediators, if you will, and that's through which interventions operate. And so really taking a deep dive on these active ingredients allows us to really understand why interventions work or do not. And getting a deeper understanding of those really allows us to concentrate on improving the outcomes of students who demonstrate academic risk, especially those students from marginalized and underserved communities. So our work around active ingredients within a program of STEM research really is focused on instructional interactions. And we've done this work across various IES-funded efficacy trials, as well as a previous exploration project, and really just to gain deeper insight into our early STEM interventions and looking at really two different constructs. One, trying to unpack treatment intensity to really develop the most intensive interventions possible for at-risk learners, and also get a grasp of response variation, why particular students respond better than others. And then in terms of why we focus on instructional interactions, arguably, and the National Research Council in 2001 argued that, even with rigorous content standards, strong teachers, well-designed and delivered interventions, psychometrically sound assessments, that it's really the instructional interactions that take place in the classroom that matter most. And by instructional interactions, we're referring to instructional interactions between teachers and students, students and teachers, and among students, so these peer-to-peer interactions. Now, our focus within our program of intervention work is primarily focused on explicit instructional interactions. There's a very robust literature that supports the use of explicit instruction when working with students with or at risk for learning difficulties. And so we've designed observation systems to really capture these explicit instructional interactions that take place within our intervention work. And to kind of sum up the types of instructional interactions that we focus on, really just three teacher behaviors, or excuse me, three behaviors. One is teacher demonstrations and explanations of academic content. So explicit modeling, clear explanations of whatever targeted content is being presented within the context of an intervention. The second behavior that we focused on coding within our observations, student practice opportunities. So looking at individual practice opportunities, but also group level practice, so like choral responses. And in terms of practice opportunities, not only within early mathematics, looking at students working with different math manipulatives, but also, and probably arguably more importantly, capturing student verbalizations. And then following student practice opportunities, we know from the literature around explicit instruction that academic feedback is absolutely critical. So feedback that's timely and specific to a previous student response. Now, the boon, if you will, of explicit instructional interactions is that they're public and observable. And so therefore they can be interpreted via direct observations, hence today's presentation. So what I'm going to do is share some findings from a study we had recently published, Learning Disability Quarterly, and we're very interested in unpacking the black box of the roots intervention. I'll describe that in just a few minutes, but the purpose of this current study was to determine whether these explicit instructional interactions, teacher modeling, student practice, and academic feedback had explanatory power in terms of contributing to the improvement of student math outcomes within the treatment condition, just within the roots intervention groups. So a quick bird's eye view of the Roots Math project. This was a multi-year IS funded efficacy trials, multi-site efficacy trial, I should say. We were focused on studying the impact of the Roots intervention, which is a small group, tier 2 kindergarten math intervention that focuses in on building students' number sense. In all, we had over 1,200 kindergarten students from approximately 140 classrooms in Oregon, as well as the Boston, Massachusetts area. We employed a partially nested randomized controlled trial design. And for the purposes of today's presentation, just focusing in on findings and the data that were captured within the Roots groups. So in each classroom, we randomly assigned students who were at risk for math difficulties to one of three conditions. It was Roots small group, which was a 2-to-1 student-teacher ratio, a Roots large group, which was a 5-to-1 student-teacher ratio, or no treatment control condition. And again, for today's presentation, I'll just focus in on the students who were randomly assigned to the two Roots intervention groups. In all, we formed 255 Roots groups with close to 900 kindergartners who were facing math difficulties. Here's a quick depiction of our theory of change for the Roots intervention, working from left to right. You can see that the Roots intervention is composed of two primary components: whole number concepts and skills, as well as principles of explicit math instruction. And those two components, when mixed and well designed and well implemented, are hypothesized to facilitate these high quality, frequent instructional interactions, again, amongst teachers and students, and as well as peer-to-peer interactions. Those interactions, in turn, are expected to turn the dial for proximal and eventually distal outcomes. So our direct observation system embedded within this IS-funded efficacy trial was a robust system. We trained staff, conduct 740 real-time observations of the 255 Roots groups. And our aim was to observe each group 3 times across the 10-week intervention time period. We completed most of those observations. We also collected close to 140 inter-observer reliability checks. I'll share those. And the average observation was approximately 21 minutes. So The one thing to point out is that we used a multifaceted direct observation system that really tried to document both the quantity and quality of explicit instructional interactions. Now, in terms of our observation system, we had two tools. The one on the left, beginning with the COST-EM, that was focused on the quantity of instructional interactions. So it's considered a low inference tool, and it's a frequency count measure in that observers are documenting the occurrences of teacher demonstrations, individual and group student practice opportunities, academic feedback, as well as student mistakes. On the right-hand side, we had the QEMI measure that was focused on the quality of instructional interactions, and that was more of a moderate inference tool, has a Likert type rating scale, and it's focused on similar behaviors to the COST-EM, but getting at more the quality of teacher demonstrations, student practice, feedback, efficiency of instruction, et cetera. Here's a quick close-up of the COST-EM, just to give you a sense of what this measure looks like. And working from left to right in the first column, column A, you can see that the observer coded the first initial teacher model. The second behavior coded was a second teacher model. The third was coded as single, or that was an individual practice opportunity, therefore carrying on from left to right. Essentially, it's you're capturing the individual occurrences of these targeted behaviors. So for the next part of the presentation, I'll go through briefly the methodology, discuss our findings around three aspects. One, just share some inter-observer reliabilities, also talk about the stability of instructional interactions, which is critical for really having any predictive utility in terms of the behaviors that you code within an observation system. And then share some findings around associations between the instructional interactions and student math outcomes. Here's our model for our inter-observer reliabilities. Essentially, we were trying to estimate the degree to which two observers, a pairing of observers, provide the same consistent information within a given real-time observation. Now, our findings here, we calculated ICCs for these, and reliability ICC essentially greater than 0.9 is considered excellent. And for the most part, we had very good reliability, inter-observer reliability, with exception of the teacher demonstration, the rates of those. And we have some hypotheses that we can discuss perhaps in the real-time meeting for the ISPI meeting. We also calculated ICCs for our stability of the behaviors captured, and really to get a strong estimate to determine how many observations are required to capture stable behaviors. That's both within the COST-EM behaviors as well as a QEMI one, so the quantity and quality of these instructional interactions. Looking in the red box, you can see the stability ICCs, and essentially anything greater than 0.5 suggests that 3 observations is sufficient to capture a stable estimate of a given behavior. As you can see, that even our quality measure all the way to teacher demonstrations, most of these, or all of the behaviors rather, fell well below that threshold. So, which would suggest that we need more observations than the 3 planned within this efficacy trial. We can discuss more at the meeting about this as well. And then finally, we had 2 primary research questions around the associations with math outcomes. One the first one is, does initial math achievement predict the quantity and quality of explicit instructional interactions? So looking at the group level initial math achievement as students began the roots intervention. And the second research question is, does the quantity and quality of these instructional interactions predict gains in student math achievement? Below, you can see our statistical model. Here are results for questions 1 and 2, just beginning on the left-hand side in the red box. You can see that Findings suggest that students, or excuse me, roots intervention groups that began the intervention with lower math achievement had higher rates of student mistakes and also received higher rates of academic feedback. When we transition to the right column in the blue box, this is looking at whether or not the quantity and quality of instructional interactions predicts gains, student math gains. We had two measures. The RAINS on the left is more of a proximal assessment, and the ASPENS is a battery of whole number CBM measures. We found that basically groups that received higher rates of group practice, these choral responses, as well as academic feedback and even higher quality instructional interactions made stronger gains than groups that did not. Interestingly, we found for the ASPENS that groups that received higher rates of individual practice had a negative effect on gains, which was very interesting and kind of contrary to some of our previous results in other efficacy trials. We can discuss more of that at the meeting as well. So to wrap things up, one, we've conducted a lot of direct observation work in our IAS-funded efficacy trials, and the findings that were presented today do align with some of our previous work that's been funded by IES. For example, in Project Fusion, we found, this is a first grade math intervention, we found similar associations between gains in student math outcomes and higher frequent rates of group practice as well as academic feedback. And we would argue that really has implications for teachers who work with students who are demonstrating risk in early mathematics. These are behaviors that can be presented or embedded within professional development as well as mathematics interventions, and ones that teachers can do and hopefully in turn boost student math outcomes. We also found similar unstable, if you will, instructional interactions in other projects that we've examined, direct observation data collected within our efficacy trials. For example, Project Cypher, which was the Goal 1 project mentioned earlier, as well as Projects Elm and Fusion. They are both IES-funded efficacy trials. And so we're seeing this instability or day-to-day variability of these behaviors that we're capturing primarily through the COST-EM measure. And so we have some hypotheses as to why that's going on, and we can share that in the meeting as well. And then to conclude, I think most would agree that observation research it's tough work, it's challenging, it's very expensive, especially when it's housed within larger efficacy trials because there are competing priorities. The primary aim is to establish the efficacy of the targeted intervention. If you're conducting real-time observations, that can be costly because of scheduling purposes or reasons, distances between geographical sites if you're conducting a multi-site efficacy trial and such. But we're carrying on with our observation work. We have plans to utilize audio recordings so that we hopefully are able to address the stability of observation measures, those behaviors that are observed, in that we can capture more observed lessons and a little bit more cost savings approach through audio recording rather than sending observers out into the field to do real-time observations. We're also utilizing our system to really try and unpack whether teachers are making instructional adjustments or these local adaptations to better meet students' needs. And so we have some ongoing work related to that, as well as really trying to unpack the different types of student practice opportunities and whether scaffolded practice is kind of more effective, if you will, than independent practice for students who are at risk. So lots of future work, and very much looking forward to sharing those results in future meetings. And if you have questions, here's my contact information. I look forward to talking to you at the ISPI meeting. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tanya Wright from Michigan State University, and this presentation is about remote classroom observations during the COVID-19 pandemic. So just a little bit more about the IES project that this is part of. This is part of a larger project called Evaluating Michigan's Early Literacy Law, Impacts, Implementation, and Improving State Capacity, with lead PI Catherine Strunk and colleagues from Michigan State University, the University of Michigan, and the Michigan Department of Education. And the purpose of this project is to understand more about our state's reading law and how it is working in the state of Michigan. So overall, we're interested in looking at the implementation of the project, the impact, and the cost of Michigan's Read by Grade 3 law, including intended and unintended consequences, and how this is impacting early literacy instruction for Michigan students. The part of the project that I'm going to talk a little bit about today, the part that my team works on, are actually classroom observations to understand teachers' instruction when they receive literacy coaching. So literacy coaching is one part of our literacy law. It's one of the policy interventions intended to support better classroom instruction in schools in Michigan. So teachers receive a literacy coach, potentially as part of the law. So the law funds literacy coaches at the ISD level, and they work with some, but not all teachers. And this part of our project is also funded by the Kellogg Foundation. So I just want to acknowledge them as funders in addition to IES. So we were busy preparing for a data collection with classroom observations where we were going to send in-person research assistants out to video instruction in classrooms where teachers had access to a literacy coach, and in classrooms where teachers did not have access to a literacy coach, to try to understand some of the differences in what this might mean for classroom instruction and the literacy instruction that children in Michigan receive. So we were planning this study in spring of 2019 with the goal of going out to classrooms in fall of 2020. In spring of 2020 with the goal of going to classrooms in fall of 2020. As we all know, in spring of 2020, there were lots of classrooms and schools shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for many schools, actually, this impacted instruction into the 2020-2021 school year. And it also impacted in-person research. So at least at MSU, we were not able to go to schools, even if they would have us, which most of them wouldn't, to do in-person classroom research in the 2020-2021 school year. So the challenge we faced was that our Michigan reading law was still in effect and still impacting classrooms. Teachers were still receiving coaching, but we now couldn't go into classrooms to actually videotape and see what was going on. So we needed to either delay our study, which was not great because we're studying the law as it was being implemented, which it still was, or find a new plan. And so we opted for finding a new plan. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So we switched from sending out in-person research assistants to go and get classroom video of literacy instruction. And we decided instead to use Swivels. So what are Swivels? Well, they're robotic mounts for either a tablet or a smartphone. And they rotate 360 degrees, and they follow whoever's wearing a wearable tracker. So if the teacher wears a wearable tracker, the swivel will rotate the tablet to record the teacher, and will also pick up audio for the teacher. We're also able to put other markers or other audio collection devices around the classroom to pick up audio a little bit further away from the teacher. So we have multiple audio sources. So this device records what's going on and then follows the teacher. And what it also does is once the teacher stops recording, it automatically uploads the videos to a cloud-based storage system that is secure. And then we are able to very quickly download those videos into our secure MSU system. So this was a huge change in plan. But what it did do is allowed us to get into classrooms and actually observe what was happening in classrooms during a time when researchers were not able to enter schools. And also during a time when some really interesting things were going on with instruction, right? We sometimes had hybrid classrooms. We sometimes had some students on Zoom and some students in person. We sometimes had students coming every other day. We had students wearing masks for the first time, and teachers and students weren't used to that at that point. So we had a lot of interesting things going on that we wanted to see into classrooms, and this technology allowed us to do that. So we decided to collect our video observations with Swivels. And during that year, we actually captured over 100 hours of elementary literacy instruction in 24 different classrooms across our state. So that was pretty exciting, particularly at a time where we couldn't get into classrooms. So what did we learn from this experience, besides that we could shift gears and change our methods pretty quickly if we kept our research goals in mind? Well, one thing we learned about this remote data collection was that it provided greater flexibility for our research team and also for the educators. So what do I mean by that? I mean, typically when we send research assistants out to a classroom, we schedule a very specific time and date. We kind of need to stick to that date. Someone's going to travel to a classroom to get the data. And so it all needs to be planned. And then when things change or go wrong, as they sometimes do, so maybe there's a fire drill on that day, or the teacher is sick on that day, that becomes a big problem to figure out rescheduling and how to get the video data within the window that researchers may want to get it. So what's really nice about the Swivel is once the teachers have the technology on site, they can really turn it on at any point. So we are able to provide them with a little more flexibility to collect the data at a time and date that is convenient for them. And it doesn't have to be matched with someone from the research team. Another interesting benefit that we didn't think about when we were changing gears, but has really been exciting, is that we can get video from more distant locations. So long as there's someone to ship the equipment to, once the equipment is at the school, we can really collect data, video data anywhere. So for us, we had initially planned to only visit schools that were within about an hour of our university. That's what we had budgeted for. But once we purchased the Swivels, we were actually able to expand our data collection area to get more regions of our state. So that's been pretty exciting. We definitely captured more and better quality classroom talk than when we used a typical video camera. So typically when we use a video camera, the teacher will wear a mic. And so we get really good quality teacher talk, but the quality of being able to capture child talk is much more limited, particularly if kids are scattered around their room, or if their back is to the camera, or if they're not near the teacher. Because we are able to put additional markers around the room, so additional audio capture around the room, when kids are moving around, if they're near one of those, or if they're nearer to one of those speakers, then we're able to capture what kids are saying. So even with kids moving around, and even with masks, we actually have much clearer child talk than we've ever had before. So that's been really exciting for us because we're really, of course, very interested in what kids are saying as they participate in instruction. Much less intrusive than sending a research team into schools. For those of you who've ever been out to video in classrooms, right? You come in, you set up your video camera. The kids are very interested in you and your video camera, and that there are strangers in the classroom. They like to come and talk to you. They like to come and be silly by the camera. This is something the teacher can just set up either on a tripod or on a desk. Once the kids sort of acknowledge that it's there, they get pretty used to it, and it's just doing its thing. And it doesn't really interrupt in the same way that having visitors to the classroom may do. And finally, overall, this has actually turned out to be less expensive than costs associated with travel and in-person data collection. So when someone's traveling, we usually pay their mileage and, of course, their time. In this case, there's an initial outlay to purchase the equipment, but once we've purchased the equipment, over time, we can continue to use it, really with no additional costs other than shipping the equipment to and from classrooms. So what have been some of the challenges of remote data collection? Well, there have been some. So, of course, supporting teachers to use the equipment. So we've done some videos, instructions that are written, and we usually have somebody they can contact if they have any questions or concerns or something doesn't seem to be working quite right with the equipment. The biggest and most important change we've had to make is supporting teachers to understand what to capture, when to turn that swivel on, when to turn it off, what we need to see. So when we send members of our research team out to capture videos of instruction, what we do is we make sure that all of those people are trained and they get exactly what we need. And that's on our end. In this case, because we're now asking the teachers to video themselves, we want to just make sure they're very, very clear about what they do and don't need to capture. At the beginning, sometimes we had teachers turning the equipment on and off at times that we really wanted it to be on. We've had some funny things happen, like teachers turn it on to have the kids get used to it being there and then turn it off and forget to turn it back on, things like that. So we've had to work through some of those issues. The nice thing about the Swivel is if it doesn't work one day, they can just turn it back on the next day. And by doesn't work, I mean they're missing something or didn't get some aspect of instruction that we hoped that they would capture. We can't ask the teachers that we in the classrooms are observing questions in real time, and they can't ask us questions in real time, although we do give them a help email and help phone number. So sometimes we're in a classroom and we see things happening with instruction, and we can do a little follow-up interview right there to say, to find out a little more information about why those decisions were made. So for example, in early literacy instruction, we often see kids learning in small groups or centers. And a question we want to know from the teachers is, how did they decide which kids should be in each group? And how did they decide what each group should learn? And that's really important, but we can't ask that right there in the classroom. So one thing we've done is developed follow-up surveys that teachers get right after they submit their video to ask some of these questions about things that might have gone on in the day. Also, we typically want to ask questions about whether or not this was a typical or usual day of instruction. And we usually ask that right after if we're in the classroom, but this is something we now do with a quick follow-up Qualtrics survey. The last thing, and this one is just always going to be a challenge with remote data collection, is it's much harder to capture notes or details about the classroom environment. So if you're hanging out in a classroom, you can take notes about the classroom environment. You can go and count how many books are on the shelf. You can look for the different types of writing tools that kids have access to, things like that. That's going to be much, much harder in a remote situation. We actually ask teachers to take photographs or to bring the video camera around and give us a little classroom tour so that we're able to see some of that the best we can, but it's really, that one is never going to be as good as being in the classroom. So if it's the physical environment that's of interest, remote data collection may be particularly challenging, and that may be a time to actually send researchers out to the classroom. So a few solutions to some of these challenges that I've already mentioned and some that are new, just a lot of information sessions and training sessions for teachers, making sure that teachers have very clear directions about what they should and shouldn't capture, always having a contact person for support who's available to teachers pretty quickly. This one I haven't mentioned yet, but very quickly checking in the data and scanning it to make sure it's complete. Again, when we send our own research team out, we typically have a checklist for them to do while they're out to make sure that they capture everything that we need them to capture. In this case, because the teachers are submitting the data, what we try to do is actually check it in within a 12 to 24 hour period, so that we can make sure that we did in fact receive everything we need. And if not, we can follow up with the teacher. Also to make sure it worked. Maybe the teacher forgot and turned the equipment off by mistake, or forgot to wear the marker, so it didn't follow them properly. There are little things that go wrong. And so we want to follow up and make sure that the teacher can record the next day if there were some sort of issue with the equipment itself. I mentioned the post-observation surveys. So this is to find out things that we would typically ask a teacher right there, but we can't do that anymore. So we have a system of post-observation surveys that go out right as soon as we check in the video data. And then I also mentioned asking teachers to film or collect additional images of the physical environment, but that really is not going to be the same as being there yourself. So that is one that if that's the key question of the research, something about the physical environment, it's probably best to actually go and be in the physical environment to find out more about it. So overall, now that many of the COVID restrictions are lifted, at least in our university, we are able to do in-person research again with safety protocols in place. Many of the schools are allowing us back. We've actually continued to use the Swivels because of many of their affordances, including being able to visit classrooms at a further distance, that wonderful audio that we have access to from multiple sources across the classroom, really being able to follow the teacher, which is hard if you're just in one corner of the classroom and the teacher's moving around, which happens a lot in elementary classrooms, and the flexibility of scheduling. So there's been a lot of really good reasons to keep using those Swivels, even now that we have fewer restrictions. This year, we're in 31 classrooms in 6 different intermediate school districts around our state, gathering a second year of data. And even though what's happening in classrooms looks more like typical classrooms than in previous years, it's still been really helpful to use the Swivels. And in fact, we've liked it so much that I'm using Swivels now in other projects as well. So for example, I have another NSF funded grant, which focuses on remote coaching of science instruction. And we want the science coaches who are far away to be able to see instruction in classrooms. And we've typically, lent teachers video cameras or have them film themselves on a phone or iPad. But now that we know about Swivels, we are sending Swivels. And they're wonderful because in a situation like science instruction, where kids are busy doing all sorts of experiences around the classroom and the teacher's moving around, it really helps us to capture what is going on and to hear what the kids have to say as they're doing their work. So overall, the affordances have been fantastic. And now that we know how to use them, I'm happen to be using them even more. So that's about all I have to say. I just want to make sure that it's clear that this isn't a plug for one type of equipment, the Swivel. It's just to give everybody a sense of how we've been able to make use of this, how we've been able to use it to change our plans during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also what we've learned from that about some of the affordances that we can continue to use moving forward.
I'm Phil Strain from the University of Denver, and I'm delighted and honored to be a part of this panel and to present this paper, Results and Lessons Learned from Using Video Recording of Preschool Classrooms to collect fidelity data. This, like many studies that occurred over the last year, was an accidental one. Accidental in the sense that it was driven primarily by outcomes associated with COVID-19, and in the specific case of the mini study, if you will, that I'm going to present today, was related to restrictions around travel and being in classroom settings and not being assigned to that classroom. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge my project officer, Emily Weaver, who was enormously supportive during this time of COVID related to our project. And in fact, in all fairness, should probably be an author on this presentation, because my recollection is it was her idea to try to capture some data that was not specifically a part of our original proposal in this IES grant, but the opportunity presented itself as a function of COVID. So I want to begin today by telling you a little bit about the context for this presentation. The project that this occurred as a part and parcel of was the development and validation of a measure that would hopefully allow us to predict the time it took for preschool special education staff members to reach fidelity, as well as to measure the predictability of sustainability once fidelity was achieved. This was a part of actually what is now just the beginning of a 5-decade series of studies on LEAP preschool, which is an inclusive early intervention model originally for young children with autism, but it's been greatly expanded to children with other categories of developmental disability. And it was in the context of this development and validation of a measure to predict initial time to reach fidelity of implementation of the LEAP model, as well as to hopefully be able to predict which programs maintain fidelity over long periods of time. And in the design of our study, that time period spanned 2 years away from initial reaching fidelity to up to 25 years. So let me tell you a couple of things about the measures that were utilized in this study. Not all the measures, but the ones that are particularly relevant for this presentation today. The measure of fidelity and sustainability is something that we've come to call the LEAP FAST, the Fidelity and Sustainability Tool. It is a 7-factor interview protocol that primarily examines administrative practices at a program level. It includes a number of the likely suspects that you might suspect would be predictive of initial fidelity as well as sustainability of fidelity. It's things like the provision of ongoing coaching to support high quality implementation. It includes having an active and dynamic leadership team that regularly looks at fidelity and looks at child outcomes and keeps asking the question, can we improve? Are we not improving? Are we experiencing slippage and doing something about it? It includes other items such as, is there a plan for the inevitable in early childhood special education? And that is, people don't stay in the field very long. So is there a series of mechanisms? Are there procedures? Are there policies that reflect the reality of staff turnover, such that staff turnover does not just automatically mean there's no more fidelity? That's one of our primary measures. The other primary measure that I want to tell you about is the LEAP Quality Program Indicators, or QPI. This is a 50-item observational scale. The data are collected prior to this past year in real time, in live classroom settings. And it reflects the unique and operational foundations of running a high quality LEAP classroom. The data that we collect, that we analyze, is the percent of those 50 items that are observed to occur at fidelity. So a score of 50 could be easily translated that the classroom situation is implementing at this point in time about half of the indicators. Score of 90, they're really close. They're knocking it out of the park. What happened to us, thankfully it was in the latter part of our study, was that we were not able to go into classroom settings and collect QPI data. So we were able to do that by adopting a technology that many of you are familiar with now, and that's Swivel. We'll talk more in depth about that in a moment. But what we were able to do, primarily through Emily's very smart invitation, is to try to cobble together some sites where we were able to collect both live and via Swivel distance fidelity data on the QPI. This allowed us to continue asking the major question of our study, and that is, does the FAST predict long-term fidelity? But because we were able to use both live as well as video recordings, we were able to ask and answer this supplemental question, and that is, what is the consistency or lack thereof, the correlation or lack thereof between data collected close in time using both live as well as video-based recordings? And let me show you some of that information. Before I do, let me also briefly share this with you. We were deeply concerned about the representativeness of one data point from each of those methods, from distance as well as live observational recordings. And so to give us a little bit more comfort with that, we developed this simple scale, which basically allowed us to answer the question, are the data points that we are sharing today from the staff's point of view representative, if you will, of a normal day, of a typical day? And Lord knows there's huge variations that just naturally occur any year in any context with preschool settings and preschool kids that make things a little bit different from the way things typically roll out. And that's probably multiplied by some factor related to COVID. I don't know what it is, but it's probably a big number. So we wanted to know whether the data that we were collecting were as representative as possible. And so we looked at, are there the same number of kids in class during this observation as is typical? Was the routine about the same? What do you think about your teaching effectiveness today versus other days? What about the number of adults in the classroom on these particular days? What about the type of adults? Is that typical or was that unusual for whatever set of reasons? How would you rate the children's just engagement in the day, their engagement in developmentally relevant activities, their fluid movement throughout the day, going from one context to the next? And how would you rate the child's challenging behavior today? About the same, worse? And were there any unusual events that you would like to tell us about? And this is an example list of the events we asked people to just circle. Again, the goal of this was just to add some confidence, if you will, that admittedly a very small behavior sample was hopefully a representative behavior sample. So here's what the data look like. And we were able to create a couple of groups of classrooms. In classrooms 1 through 5, these were settings in which people were involved in the initial phase of coaching. And so you'll see a range across classrooms 1 and 5, from live to Swivel-based recordings that range from the mid-30s to the high 50s, about what you would expect based upon our prior data doing this work with now over 150 classroom settings throughout the US. And what is true from our visual analysis, and perhaps it's true from your visual analysis, is that when separated by 2 weeks or less in time, that is the live video sample and the Swivel video sample, there's remarkable similarity in the percent of LEAP quality program indicators that we scored using both of these techniques. In classrooms 6 through 10, these were classrooms that ranged from 10 to 22 years away from their initially reaching fidelity in LEAP. They had maintained over long periods of time, and it's reflective, I believe you may conclude, from their QPI data, both live and using Swivel. And as you can see here, again, there's remarkable consistency within classrooms, no matter what the alternative was, whether it's live or Swivel. Incidentally, we also, for each of the 10 classrooms, collected IOA, Inter-Observer Agreement data And that data exceeded 90% agreement across all sets of observers across all classrooms. So we saw, again, very little variability, if you will, that could be attributed to whether or not we were getting data on classroom quality implementation, either live or via Swivel. So we were fairly encouraged by these data. And I'd like to share with you some ideas, some tentative conclusions that we have drawn from this experience. There are some issues that we experience with the use of Swivel. They may not be particularly generalizable to other contexts, to other observational systems, to other sets of target behaviors that one is trying to observe. We noticed, in comparison to somebody coming into a classroom, much greater adult initial hesitancy around the use of video recording than we had previously with trying to solicit participation using live observation. Over the course of time, we felt like that this hesitation was moderated some. This is specifically in the classrooms that were still in the coaching process, where we had multiple data points. But that is something that I did want to share, that for your information, just to look out for, if that's an alternative that you might choose to implement it sometimes. Things break. It's a mechanical, an electromechanical device. I'm not saying anything bad about quality of Swivel technology. All technology breaks down. That's true for us as well. As good as the audio recording is on Swivel, and that's one of the primary reasons why we selected that methodology, is ambient noise is still an issue. It was not an issue in terms of being comfortable scoring the quality program indicators. However, if you were particularly interested in scoring specific child verbal behaviors, this would be something that I would be hesitant in recommending. There are certainly other methodologies that are directly focused to capturing those kinds of data, and so it was sufficient for our purposes, but we knew we couldn't get into depth, if we had other questions around specific child verbal behavior. Adult verbal behavior was captured quite nicely with this technology. We also found that, and not surprising, in the just natural chaos of preschool settings, adults move, kids move. That's a great thing in terms of just engagement and having a fun, exciting environment to be a part of every day. But it's a real challenge. And so we, at a minimum, used a 2-camera setup, which of course incurs cost. But we found that to be necessary to get reliable data and to be confident in the data. We also found that we needed real time, even with Swivel, which has some cool technological features that allows movement in terms of orientation of what is captured on video and audio that folks on site needed to pick up and move the swivels, the cameras, for us to capture everything that we needed to capture to adequately record QPI data. And we did that primarily through a remote bug in the ear device where we simply cued people, could you please move to stage left, camera 1. So those are some hesitancies. Let me tell you about some benefits to Swivel. One is that you have a wonderful permanent product, and it's a great tool when you have that permanent product if you're in a coaching mode versus a simple data collection only mode. We found that Swivel was also very cost effective. Most of our LEAP sites are in the thousands of miles away from Denver. And so each QPI data point can wind up costing us $2,000 if we're paying for it. So it gets to be very expensive. And while Swivel is not inexpensive, it's certainly, if you're collecting multiple data points across multiple classrooms, arguably, it's a significant cost savings that could well be incurred. The other thing that we noticed with our classrooms that were in a coaching mode is that at the end of this process, they were enormously enthusiastic about the level of support that they got from us via distance. We were a little surprised by this because we thought people really like to see our smiling faces, and perhaps they do, but perhaps they want even more help, more than they just want a live person in a classroom setting. So that was a nice benefit for our clients as well as for us. And I'm looking forward to questions that may come to me or other members of the panel. And thank you very much for your attention to this presentation.
Hi, my name is Sarah Brazel, and I'm a program officer at the National Center for Special Education Research. And I'm joined by my colleague, Emily Weaver, who's also a NICSR program officer. And thank you all for attending today's session on innovations in observation data collection analysis. I'd like to provide a few directions for this question and answer session. If you have a question, just to conserve time, we'd like you to direct your question in the chat directly to the presenter by selecting their name in the chat. So don't post it for everyone, directly select the person you want to ask the question to, and so that way they can answer it. However, if you want to share something about your own research, any innovations you've been doing, we would love to hear that at the end. Please message Emily Weaver in the chat if you have something you'd like to share. If you do have a question that's general for anyone, you can put that in the chat. We are going to begin in order of the presentations with questions sent specifically to the presenters, and then we'll save the general questions to the end. We are currently not using the raise hand feature. Maybe if we have some time at the end, we will. But right now we're asking that all questions be directed directly to the presenter or to Emily Weaver if you'd like to share something. Also, if you have any resources or tools you want to share with the group, you can also use the chat to share any links or resources. Okay, now let's see. We're going to begin with Chris Dobler from the University of Texas at Austin. And Chris, I know in your presentation, you also mentioned 3 things that you probably could discuss during this time. So each person's going to have about 5 minutes to answer questions, but also if there's any other information you wanted to discuss, feel free to jump into that. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Sarah. So it looks like, well, good afternoon, everyone. So it looks like the first question is, do we have any hypotheses about the source of instability in the observational variables? Yes, there are things we haven't really formally tested, so they're more kind of speculations, if you will. We've been working with this system for a good 10 years now across multiple IES-funded efficacy trials, and lots of lessons learned with that. And the variance, this day-to-day variability, if you will, it at first, when we started conducting these COSTI observations, where we're collecting the occurrences of these teaching practices, we were in a core math instructional setting, and we saw lots of instability. So we assumed it had to do largely in part to the change in topics or areas of mathematics that core instruction would focus on. So for example, one day you may have whole number understanding, focused on operations, switch to problem solving, the geometry, measurement, et cetera. And so we thought it may be content related. Whereas to kind of test that, if you will, that speculation in the Roots project, which I presented on, that is a whole number interventions. It builds students' early number sense. So in many ways, we were controlling the content, yet we still saw that instability. So there's something else going on. Whoever posed this question seems to be spot on to many of our hypotheses in terms of it's likely an instructional sequence where we're going in and observing, or our observations were done more on a convenience scheduling, if you will. It's very difficult to get into classrooms, and especially in these large scale studies. So we weren't as strategic as probably we should be to see where we need to pinpoint particular lessons across all groups. I think we can do better with that. There's also possibility of fluctuation due to where in the school week. As in terms of the school year, Roots is approximately 10 weeks. And so in our previous studies, it begins just after the holiday break and runs for 10 weeks. So that's held constant, but there is something going on in terms of this day-to-day variability. So hopefully that addresses your question. It's a good one. Other things, let's see. There's a question posed by Michelle Woodbridge, and just asking about needing more than 3 observations. Our methodologists from Oregon Research Institute, Keith Smolkowski and Derek Costi, we've looked at, again, these types of data across multiple projects. And what's really surfaces that we need more data points. We need to get into these groups, these classrooms, more than three times. Yet the key thing is these direct observations are being conducted within the context of efficacy trials, which testing the efficacy, understanding for whom and under which conditions these interventions work, even though the observations kind of fall into the latter. Those are the top priorities, and there's resource implications for going in and observing more than 3 times. And so, but what we found in just running some preliminary analyses is that for the behaviors that are dropping below a certain threshold of stability, if you will, we need 6 to 10 observations. And you can imagine in a large scale multi-site efficacy trial, whereas in the Roots study, we're in districts throughout the state of Oregon, as well as Boston, Massachusetts, it becomes very costly, especially to get folks in there during real time and beyond that. So, I think it lays the ground for a future observation study to be able to go in and conduct more than 3 observations in a given setting. Great question.
And Chris, sorry, I think that's the end of the 5 minutes. So we're going to have to move on to Tanya. We'll come back if we have time at the end. Tanya, any questions you were sent directly you want to address?
Yes. Hi, everybody. So there seemed to be quite a few questions about teacher hesitancy as far as being video recorded. So, I mean, yes, in general, that's the case. In our situation, we were already planning to video record teachers. It was just that it was our team that was going to do that. With the Swivels, they video record themselves, essentially. there was less hesitancy, I would say, once they got over the how does the equipment work, to do it themselves than to have us come and spend a lot of time in their classrooms. So overall, once the initial sort of lift of how does the Swivel work? What do I have to do? They tended to prefer to just turn that on than to have us spending time in their spaces. I received a lot of questions about permissions. We get active parent consent to video. So once that Swivel's in the classroom, we need to get consent because the kids are in the video. So someone said they're more interested in adult behaviors. Well, that's true. For example, in my other project, we're interested in teacher science instruction, but the kids are who's there getting the instruction. So we still, because it's video and it's the children, and what they do is they're stored with us forever. We do get parent permission. We definitely have some parents that refuse, and so what we do is we provide the teacher, even though the teacher collected the permissions for us, we make sure to provide a list of anyone who's refused, so they can be positioned in a place that the Swivel doesn't cover, or with the back of their head to the Swivel if necessary. And if we know who those kids are, and we don't use anything that they do or say. So that's how consents work. Some questions or concerns about cloud storage. So our university is pretty tough about the types of cloud storage we can use, and they feel like Swivel's policies are actually acceptable. That said, we pull them off the cloud we pull them off onto our own system, our MSU cloud system, within 24 hours. And we just don't want them hanging out there. So we remove them from places we remove the data from places that anyone could see it or touch it. Trying to go through these as quickly as possible. Budget implications for Swivels. The Swivels are less expensive than people, not surprisingly, I guess. Right. Every time you send someone out to collect data, especially if the location is far away, there's their travel, there's their time. In addition to the video equipment. In this case, it's really just the video equipment. We do ship the Swivels to a point person, typically at the school. So we do need a point person. We don't want to ship it to a building that, and have it be sitting outside in the cold or something like that. But once we have that point person and we make a plan for how it's going to be stored, typically it's stored somewhere and the teachers just go get it when they need it.
Time for one more.
Okay. There's so many. Difficulties with nudging teachers to record and upload. And I would say, yes, some teachers need more nudging than others. In our case, the teachers are participants in our study as well. And so there's usually, the study incentives for participating, so they know this is part of what they are going to be doing. But yep, some of them do it right away, some of them don't. One thing we really do try to do is actually ask them for when they are planning to do their video, because we want it within a particular window. That way it's sort of scheduled, so they know when they're supposed to get the equipment. We know when we're supposed to check it in, and if it's not there when we expect it, we can check in right away and try to figure out what went wrong, in case there was a technology issue, or if something in the real life of school happened, school closed that day or whatever, we try to make a plan with them right away. So we still do the planning. We still do the planning and coordination part, so that we can get the data within the window that we're hoping to get it.
I'm just going to review the expectations before moving on to Phil Strain. If you could please directly message your question to the speaker so that they could answer, or they can also talk about it in when they have an opportunity to speak, because that way they can answer it while other people are speaking. And then post in the chat only general questions for any speaker. Okay, now Phil Strain. Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Yeah, so as I go through the questions in the chat, it looks like I could say I totally agree with Tanya and cover everything, but I will add a couple of things that are a little bit different. So we had an initial hesitancy, as I pointed out in the presentation, and it was really driven by not understanding the technology. It wasn't about being observed. You have to understand that in the context of this particular study, in many of these situations, we have a multi-year, in some cases, a multi-decade relationship with people. So our intrusiveness, whether it's showing up in person or asking them to use Swivel, is not so much an issue. It's mostly uncomfortableness related to the technology. But here's how folks really became Swivel aficionados. We suggested to them, is there a way that you might think about using this video footage for your own professional development? Let's think of an example. Let's say you have, as they did in COVID and still do, you have influx of brand new people constantly coming in your classroom. Oh, here's another person filling in for so-and-so who's out ill or taking care of someone who is ill. Might you show them an exemplary video of how they can help you do a whole group instruction around story time? Yeah, that might be helpful. And so Swivel videos became something that just weren't used for our research purposes, but could be an ongoing benefit. So that was a real difference, I think, perhaps in people's willingness and eventual excitement about being involved in that technology. I don't know if there are other specific items that we did the same thing. Our university was really concerned about confidentiality. And so we had to pull things off, although I'm not sure University of Denver is better than Swivel in terms of their protective mechanisms. They're just happy to be parochial on the subject. So that's how we negotiated that piece of the equation. I would also say that prior to our use of Swivel, for all of the sites that we were involved in this project, it was understood that they were going to get affirmative parental permission for a variety of different data collection methods, which could potentially include the use of video.
Okay, great, thank you. We're going to turn now to Emily, who's been reviewing the chat and also any messages she's been getting. Is there anything you think we could direct to the speakers or anyone else who wanted to speak?
I have been wondering, I'm seeing a lot of practical information exchange in the chat, and I'm wondering if the panelists have anything they could share from a practical standpoint if you were designing an observation study from scratch, or a study that would use observational variables, how you would go about setting that up to make sure you're getting, good, dependable data are there things that people might not think of that to include on the permission forms or to think through logistically that you might want to share with folks?
I can share one quick thing that we've learned across the different projects. In one of our earliest efficacy trials, we started training a large cadre of folks at different sites. And while that was great in terms of being able to cover more ground, observations, more classrooms at one time, what we found to be most powerful for collecting more reliable data, even though we're still dealing with that instability issue, I think it goes beyond the observers or the observation team, was just working with a smaller group that are maybe higher skilled, if you will, and we have better control. So we have controlled the controls a little bit more with those groups, and we found that functions well, better, I guess, if you will, than a larger group.
And Tanya, you can jump in.
This would be a total switch of topic, but I saw a question that didn't get answered. If that's okay, unless we want to follow up with more.
Yeah, no, please.
Someone asked about having more than one camera or swivel in a classroom at a time. And I never got to answer that question. We did not have more than one camera, in part because the camera can really follow, because the robot follows the person wearing the marker. We did have extra, they're not really markers, but extra recorders around the classroom. So we do ask teachers that if they're going to have kids in groups, that they put the little extra recording devices in other spots in the classroom. So even though our main audio is what the teacher is wearing, that is very helpful if you know there's going to be small group conversations or children are going to be talking to one another, because if the teacher's far away, we may not pick up that conversation. So we actually have 2 extra audio sources that we got.
And
yeah,
Tanya,
and we use 2 cameras a lot. It's the nature of preschool. There's no such thing as a lead teacher, right? We could have actually used 3 cameras. You know, that would get too crazy and too expensive for us, just as a logistical issue. But the things that are important that happen in preschool don't happen in a place, and are not driven by one adult. And so, you know, I think that's a special consideration when you're thinking about preschool environments and the wonderful chaos that is associated with them.
And I think also, like, the video and audio setup is going to be driven by your research question and what you're interested in. So for example, our question is focused on elementary teachers' instruction during literacy. So I need to follow the instruction from the teacher who received coaching. It's a coaching study. So I'm following that person and seeing what they're doing. So if you have a different research question, right, you're going to set it up to get the information that you need.
Tanya, did you have a way to capture if teachers set things up correctly, like you asked them, is there something that comes from metadata that you can look at to make sure you're capturing what you intended to capture on that video? Or did you have rules about like what you would include or exclude or something practical like that?
They get an instructions sheet, they get a little mini video explaining it, and then our team checks it in within 24 hours to make sure there's nothing that we missed or nothing surprising or unusual that happened.
Let's see. Phil, you have a question that was just posted in the chat.
I realized it was.
Is that Mary Beth?
delayed.
Go ahead, Mary Beth. Go ahead and
Yeah.
say it out loud.
So what I was really asking about is in a lot of the classrooms and Tanya, you might run into this too. Special ed and general ed teachers are working together, and sometimes there's even a paraprofessional in there. And this is high incidence classrooms, not just classrooms where you might have students with more significant disabilities. So I'm just wondering how, Phil, you talked about multiple adults in the early learning classroom. How do you deal with that? Maybe, and if Tanya, you have something to add, you could add to that too.
Well, in almost all of the classrooms that we did this work in, there was a co-teaching arrangement. It was really part of the model itself. So there was a lead early childhood special education certified teacher and a lead regular early childhood teacher. And those were the two folks who were the primary foci of Swivel. That being said, there were occasionally visits in the classroom by speech and language pathologists, OT, PT, classroom assistants. So it's a really important point that you bring up, Mary, and I think it points to not just a limitation of the Swivel and other distance technology, but to observational methods themselves. When you have multiple mediators of instruction behaving simultaneously in the same setting. I don't know anybody who's figured out how to fully comprehensively capture that richness.
There is one new comment about whether or not anyone's aware of districts having a service agreement with Swivel, so that they may restrict some of the access to data before it goes to the researchers.
In our case, lots of districts are using Swivels already for their various aspects of professional development, various projects they're doing. People love Swivels. So they're sometimes more advanced in their Swivel use and understanding than we were when we first got started. So we haven't seen that as a concern. In fact, the districts we work with are surprised at how adamant we have to be about getting child permissions, because they typically already get a blanket child permission for using children's images in various ways as part of their work. So they're always asking us why we also have to do that when they already have it, and we have to explain that we have, the university level IRB that we have to do as well. So we haven't had that as a problem.
And I did want to note that there is a comment in the chat from Christina Chin to be sure to visit the message board on the meeting platform afterwards to post additional questions, comments, or suggestions to continue the conversation, because we are going to have to end this session. And I also am posting a reminder to please rate this session and also provide additional comments. Emily and I have talked about doing a future webinar or continuing this topic, because it is continuing to be an area of interest and need, just this area of innovating and observation, data collection, analysis. So also, feel free to share with us what you're interested in so that we can keep this going if that's an area of interest for you. And definitely would like to thank our presenters. I did a great job. I learned a lot from the presentations. If you did not have a chance to watch all of it fully, I highly recommend you go back and watch the presentations. Thank you all for attending today. It made a great turnout for the session.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Did a great job.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah,
No problem.
thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Very well organized. Appreciate it.